On the night of January 12th, 1888, the temperature in western Kansas dropped from 40 degrees above zero to 18 degrees below zero in 6 hours. The wind howled at 55 miles per hour. The wind chill plunged to 60 degrees below zero. Cold enough to freeze exposed skin in 4 minutes. Cold enough to kill a healthy man within sight of his own door. Across 4 counties, 67 people died that night. Farmers found frozen in their barns. Children discovered in snowdrifts just yards from their homes. Entire families entombed in cabins that had run out of firewood. But in a shallow cave along the chalk bluffs of Gove County, a small fire crackled. Warmth radiated from limestone walls, and the people huddled inside were alive. The shelter protecting them had cost $12 to build. It was made of bent willow saplings and flattened tin cans. The boy who built it was 18 years old. 5 months earlier, every neighbor within 20 miles had told him the same thing: that he would die before spring, that his little sister would die with him, that his shelter was a joke, a pile of garbage, a grave he was digging with his own hands. They called him the crazy cave boy. They laughed at his tin cans. They bet money on when he would fail. They were wrong. Every single one of them was wrong. The train from Pennsylvania pulled into Grainfield, Kansas on a scorching afternoon in August of 1887. Callum Brennan stepped onto the platform first, squinting against the brutal prairie sun. He was 18 years old, tall and lean, with the calloused hands of someone who had worked since childhood. His eyes were the pale blue of winter ice, and they held a steadiness that made people uncomfortable. Behind him came Rosie, 12 years old, dark hair braided down her back. A face that should have belonged to a carefree child, but instead carried the weight of too much loss, too soon. Between them walked Odin, a border collie with one blue eye and one brown, 3 years old, belonging to no one now except these two orphans. The dog had been their grandfather's, trained to herd sheep in the mountains of Norway before crossing the ocean in the belly of a ship. Now he pressed close to Rosie's leg, sensing her fear, offering what comfort he could. They stood on that platform with everything they owned: one trunk containing clothes, tools, and a leather-bound journal filled with drawings and notes in their grandfather's careful hand. One rifle with 17 cartridges, 87 cents in Callum's pocket, and a hand-drawn map marking a location in the chalk bluffs 15 miles north. That was all that remained of the $74 they had started with. Their grandmother, Ira, had sold everything she could before she died. Furniture, dishes, even her wedding ring, all of it converted to cash to give her grandchildren a chance. The train tickets had cost $62 for the three of them. Another $8 went to supplies in Philadelphia before they left. The filing fee for the homestead claim would take 3 more. 87 cents to last until they could grow or hunt their own food. 2 years earlier, they had been a family of 6: mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, and the 2 of them. Then scarlet fever came through their town in Pennsylvania. It took their mother in 3 days. It took their father a week later. 2 coffins lowered into the same grave because there was no money for separate plots. Callum was 16, Rosie was 10. They moved in with their grandparents, Era and Magnus Halvard, and for a time things were stable. Magnus had been a master builder in Bergen, Norway, before coming to America. He had constructed homes for wealthy families in Philadelphia. But his true passion was something else entirely. He was obsessed with the old ways, the techniques his own grandfather had taught him in the mountains of Scandinavia: how to build shelters that stayed warm without burning endless wood, how to use the earth itself as insulation, how to survive winters that would kill anyone who relied on conventional methods. From the time Callum was 8 years old, Magnus taught him everything. Every evening after dinner, they would sit together at the kitchen table. Magnus would open his journal and explain the principles. He would draw diagrams of turf houses and underground rooms. He would describe the physics of thermal mass, how the earth maintained a steady temperature year-round once you got deep enough. Heat rises, Magnus would say. Cold sinks. The earth remembers neither summer nor winter. It keeps its own counsel. If you are wise, you build your shelter to borrow from the earth instead of fighting against it. Callum absorbed every word. Then Magnus died in March of 1887, a cough that turned to pneumonia. Gone in 2 weeks. 3 months later, Era followed him. She left behind the money from selling everything the hand-drawn map, and a note. Your grandfather found this place years ago, she wrote. He always said that if we ever needed to start over, this is where we would go. There is a cave in the chalk bluffs. The earth there holds its temperature. He believed a shelter could be built there that would survive any winter. I am too old to make the journey, but you are not. Go, Callum, take your sister, build what Magnus dreamed of building, and prove to the world what he taught you. So they went. The land office clerk in Grainfield looked at Callum like he was insane. You want to file a homestead claim on a parcel in the chalk bluffs, the clerk said. Nobody farms the bluffs. The soil is too thin. The terrain is too rough. Most folks want flat ground. I do not want to farm, Callum said. I want to build. Build what? A shelter. The clerk shook his head but processed the paperwork anyway. The filing fee was $3, which Callum paid in coins worn smooth from handling. When he walked out of that office, he had 87 cents to his name. The borrowed wagon that brought them from Grainfield to the bluffs cost nothing because the driver was heading in that direction anyway. He dropped them at the base of the chalk formations just as the sun began to set. Callum stood there looking up at the white cliffs glowing orange in the fading light. The cave was exactly where Magnus had marked it, a shallow bite in the pale stone, 15 feet deep and 8 feet high at the mouth, narrowing to a crack at the back. Water stains ran down the walls where rain had found its way in over the centuries. The floor was uneven, littered with fallen chalk and the bones of animals that had crawled inside to die. But when Callum stepped inside, he felt it immediately. The temperature. Outside, the August heat pressed down like a physical weight, baking the prairie under a sun that felt like an open furnace door. Inside the cave, the air was cool. Not just shaded cool, steady cool. He pressed his palm against the chalk wall and closed his eyes. Just like grandfather said, he whispered. Rosie stood at the entrance. Odin pressed against her leg. Are we going to live in here? She asked. Her voice was small, scared. The voice of a 12-year-old who had lost everyone except her brother and was now standing in a hole in the ground in a place where she knew no one. Callum turned to face her. We are going to build something here, he said. Something grandfather designed in his head, but never got the chance to create. When we're done, this will be the warmest home in Kansas. Rosie looked around at the bare stone, the animal bones, the water stains. Promise, she asked. Promise. Word traveled fast in empty country. By the time Callum had unloaded their trunk and set up a makeshift camp inside the cave, Silas Thornton was riding up on a bay mare that looked better fed than he did. Thornton was the nearest neighbor, 3 miles east, a Norwegian bachelor who had survived 12 Kansas winters in a soddy that leaked heat like a sieve. He was 50 years old, with a face carved by wind and disappointment, the kind of face that had seen too many people fail. He dismounted slowly, studied the cave mouth, studied Callum, studied Rosie, studied the cave mouth again. You are the orphans from back east, he said. We are. This is your claim. It will be. I filed this morning. Thornton walked to the entrance and looked inside. He stood there for a long moment, hands on his hips, then turned back with an expression Callum would come to know well. The expression that said they were already dead. They just did not know it yet. I have buried 5 neighbors since I came to Kansas, Thornton said. 2 frozen blizzards. 3 starved when their crops failed. I have seen men with twice your resources give up by Christmas. He paused. A boy of 18 and a girl of 12, living in a hole in the rock. You will be dead before spring, and that child will die with you. Rosie pressed closer to Callum. Odin growled low in his throat, a rumble of warning. We will survive, Callum said. Will you? Thornton's voice held no cruelty, only a flat certainty. Have you cut 8 cords of firewood by yourself? Have you hunted your own meat through 3 feet of snow? Have you kept a fire burning for 4 months straight while caring for a child? 8 cords. The number landed in Callum's stomach like a stone. That is what you will need, Thornton continued. 8 cords minimum, and that is for a proper cabin with a good stove. For that, he gestured at the cave. I do not even know what you would need. Nobody lives in caves. There is a reason for that. Callum felt Rosie's hand slip into his, gripping tight. My grandfather lived through winters in Norway that would freeze every person in this county, he said. He taught me things. Old ways. Ways that work. Thornton's expression shifted, something between pity and disgust. The old ways did not keep your grandfather alive, did they, he said. And they will not keep you alive either. He mounted his horse. I will check on you in October. If you are still here, I might be able to help you build something proper before the real cold comes. But I am telling you now, the way you are planning it, you will not make October. He rode away without looking back. Callum watched him go, then turned to face the cave. 87 cents, 2 children, a dome, and the knowledge his grandfather had spent a lifetime gathering. Winter was 5 months away. Here is something most people do not understand about survival. It is not about fighting nature. It is about understanding it, working with it instead of against it. Every winter, thousands of people across the prairie states burn cord after cord of wood trying to heat their homes from 0 degrees to 65 degrees. That is a 65-degree difference. It requires enormous amounts of fuel. But what if you did not have to heat from 0? What if you could start from a much warmer baseline? Callum Brennan understood this. His grandfather had taught him. The earth, once you get deep enough, maintains a steady temperature year-round. In Kansas, that temperature hovers in the mid-50s. Not warm enough to be comfortable, but not cold enough to kill. If you could seal a space against the wind and use the earth as your foundation, you would only need to add a few degrees of warmth. A small fire instead of a roaring blaze. A fraction of the wood. That changes everything. The question was whether an 18-year-old boy with 87 cents could actually build something that would prove his grandfather right. What do you think? Could he do it? Let me know in the comments. The first problem was not the cave. It was distance. The nearest trees, a thin line of cottonwoods along a creek 3 miles south, might as well have been on the moon. Callum had no horse, no mule, no wagon of his own. Every stick of firewood would have to be carried by hand. He did the mathematics at night, lying on a blanket on the cave's uneven floor, while Rosie slept beside him and Odin kept watch at the entrance. 1 cord of wood equaled 128 cubic feet, a pile 4 feet wide, 4 feet high, and 8 feet long. A cord weighed between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds. 8 cords meant 30,000 pounds of wood. 30,000 pounds carried 3 miles by a boy who weighed 140 pounds. At 50 pounds per trip, the most he could realistically carry, that was 600 trips. 600 trips of 6 miles round journey. 3,600 miles of walking just for the firewood. And he had to cut it first, and split it, and stack it, and do all of this while keeping Rosie fed, filing his homestead claim, and making the cave habitable before the first freeze. The numbers did not work. No matter how he arranged them, the numbers did not work. He thought about Thornton's words, "You will be dead before spring." He thought about giving up, and then, lying in the darkness, he heard his grandfather's voice. Not a memory exactly, more like a presence. The way Magnus used to sit beside him when he was struggling with a problem, waiting patiently until Callum found the answer himself. "What do you see?" the voice seemed to ask. "What does the cave tell you?" Callum closed his eyes and listened. Then he thought about something else. The cave was not cold. In August, with the prairie baking under a sun that felt like God's own furnace, the cave held a steady coolness. Callum had noticed it the first day and thought nothing of it. Shade was shade. But lying awake in the darkness, he realized it was more than that. The air inside the cave was not just cooler than outside. It was exactly the same temperature it had been that morning, and the morning before, and the morning before that. He remembered his grandfather's words. "The earth keeps its own temperature," Magnus had said. 50-some degrees year-round once you get deep enough. The heat of summer cannot reach it. The cold of winter cannot either. If you are wise, you use this. You do not fight the earth, you borrow from it. Callum sat up in the darkness. If the cave held steady in August, it would hold steady in January. The same temperature, year-round. Not warm enough to be comfortable, but not cold enough to kill. The wood he needed was not for heating a space from 0 to 65 degrees. It was for adding just a few degrees to what the earth already provided. A fraction of the fuel, a fraction of the work. The mathematics changed, but the cave mouth was open to the wind. Every bit of warmed air would blow straight out into the Kansas night. He needed to close the opening somehow. Not just plug it, but create a space that could be heated efficiently, a shelter within a shelter. He remembered watching Odin curl into a tight ball to sleep, conserving heat by reducing exposed surface area. Nature has already solved every problem, Magnus used to say. You only need to observe. A dome. The idea came together slowly over 3 sleepless nights. He could not afford lumber. He could not afford nails in the quantities a proper wall would need. He could not afford glass or hinges or any of the things a real building required. But he had seen pictures of wiki-ups in books, the dome shelters the Apache built from bent saplings and hides. And he had noticed the trash pile behind the general store in Grainfield, heaped with empty tin cans that nobody wanted, saplings he could cut himself. There were willows along the creek where the cottonwoods grew, willows bent, tin cans he could have for free. He would not build a cabin at all. He would build a dome, a curved wall of bent saplings covered in flattened tin cans, fitted across the cave mouth like a cork in a bottle. A space maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, small enough to heat with a fraction of the wood a cabin would need. The cave itself would be his insulation. The rock would be his walls. The chalk, which had spent 1,000,000 years at the same temperature, would be his thermal mass. The next morning, Callum walked to Grainfield, 9 miles each way. He needed to ask about tin cans. The general store was owned by a man named Harlan Cobb. Cobb was 50 years old, with a belly that strained his suspenders and fingers perpetually stained with tobacco juice. He had small eyes that calculated everything they saw, measuring worth, assessing weakness, looking for advantage. He listened to Callum's request with growing disbelief. "You want my trash," Cobb said. "Yes, sir. Tin cans. Empty ones. As many as you have." Cobb stared at him for a long moment. Then he started to laugh. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had just heard the funniest thing in months and could not wait to share it with everyone he knew. "Oh boy," he said, "I have seen some desperate settlers in my time, but you might be the sorriest case yet. You know what people are saying about you? That crazy orphan boy who is going to live in a cave. Now you want to build something out of garbage. Will you give me the cans or not? Oh, I will give them to you." Cobb leaned forward, close enough that Callum could smell the tobacco and old sweat. "I will give you every blessed can behind this store, and I will throw in some from the hotel too. But I am telling you right now, you are wasting your time. Whatever fool thing you are building, it will not save you when the real cold comes. I have seen blizzards in Kansas that would freeze a man solid in 4 minutes. Your garbage hut is not going to stop that." He grinned, showing brown teeth. "Tell you what, though, when you give up, and you will give up, you come see me. I might be able to find some work for a boy willing to do certain jobs. Nothing fancy, but it will keep you and that little sister fed." Callum looked at him steadily. "And if I do not give up?" Cobb's smile faded slightly. "Then I suppose we will see who was right," he said. "But I know this land, boy. I know what winter does to people who are not prepared. And you are not prepared." He leaned back. "The tin cans are behind the store. Take as many as you want. Consider it my contribution to the entertainment." Callum nodded once, turned and walked out. Behind him he heard Cobb already telling someone about the crazy cave boy who wanted to build a house out of garbage. He did not look back. What Callum did not know was that Harlan Cobb had his own reasons for wanting the orphans to fail. The chalk bluffs contained deposits of high-quality limestone. A quarry company from Kansas City had expressed interest in the area, offering good money for mineral rights. But they needed large, consolidated parcels to make extraction worthwhile. Callum's homestead claim sat right in the middle of the most promising section. If the boy proved it up his claim, 5 years of continuous residence, the land would be his permanently. The quarry deal would become complicated, expensive, possibly impossible. But if the boy died or gave up, or simply failed to meet the homestead requirements, the land would revert to the public domain, available for anyone to file on. Cobb had been planning to file on that exact parcel himself. He had connections at the land office. He had money for bribes. He had been waiting for the right moment. Then these orphans showed up with their 87 cents and their ridiculous plans. Cobb gave them the tin cans with a smile because he was absolutely certain they would fail. And when they did, he would be ready. He did not know about Magnus Halvard's journal. He did not know about the physics of thermal mass. He did not know that the boy he dismissed as crazy had been trained by one of the finest builders Norway had ever produced. But he would learn. They would all learn. By September 1st, Callum had carried more than 400 tin cans from Grainfield to the cave. He made the trip twice a week, 18 miles round journey, with a canvas sack on his back that grew heavier with each step. His shoulders ached constantly. His feet blistered, healed, and blistered again. He lost weight he could not afford to lose. But the cans accumulated. He flattened each one with a rock, hammering until it lay more or less flat, then stacking them inside the cave where Rosie could not cut herself on the sharp edges. The pile grew. The saplings came harder. Willows along the creek were thin and numerous, but they had to be cut, stripped of branches, and carried 3 miles uphill. Each sapling weighed only a few pounds, but he needed dozens of them. His hands cracked and bled from the work. The hatchet he had bought for 78 cents, the cheapest one in Grainfield, was dull within a week and needed constant sharpening. Rosie helped where she could. She was 12 years old, thin and pale, but she worked without complaint. She handed tools when asked. She fetched water from the creek 2 miles away. She watched the camp while Callum was gone, Odin always at her side. She understood, in the way children understand things without being told, that their survival depended on what her brother was building. When dinner was thin, she did not complain. When she cut her hand on a tin edge, she wrapped it in cloth and kept working. When the nights grew cold and the blankets were not enough, she curled against Odin's warm body and did not cry. Callum watched her and felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on his chest like a physical thing. He was 18 years old. He was building a shelter from garbage, and his sister's life depended on him being right. Reverend Ezekiel Whitmore came to visit in mid-September. He was the minister of the small church in Grainfield, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a voice that carried the certainty of divine authority. He had heard about the cave boy and his garbage shelter, and he felt it was his Christian duty to intervene. "Young man," he said, standing at the entrance to the cave, watching Callum flatten tin cans. "I understand you are from Pennsylvania." "Yes, sir, and your people. They were of Scandinavian origin. My grandfather was from Norway. My grandmother was Welsh." Whitmore nodded slowly as if this confirmed something he had suspected. "The Scandinavian lands," he said, "they have a long history of pagan practices, worship of false god, Thor, Odin." At the sound of his name, the Bond lifted his head. "Knowledge passed down from those traditions," Whitmore continued, "is not always knowledge that serves the Lord. Sometimes it is knowledge that leads men astray." Callum stopped hammering. "My grandfather was a good man," he said quietly, "the best man I ever knew. I'm sure he was well-intentioned, but the old ways, the pagan ways, they have no place here in Christian country. What you are building," he gestured at the pile of tin cans and saplings, "it is not natural. It is not the way God-fearing people build homes." Rosie stepped out of the cave, Odin at her side. "Our grandfather taught us to survive," she said. Her voice was clear and steady. "He taught us to use what God gave us. The earth, the trees, the metal that other people throw away. How is that not Christian?" Whitmore looked at her, surprised by her boldness. "Child," he said, "I am concerned for your welfare. This boy, your brother, is leading you down a path that ends in suffering. I have seen winters in Kansas that would make you weep. What he is building will not protect you." "Then what would you have us do?" Callum asked. "Come to town. The church has resources. We can find families willing to take you in. Separately, of course. A boy your age can work for his keep. The girl can be placed with a proper family until she is old enough to marry." Rosie's hand found Callum's. "We stay together," Callum said. "That is not always possible. Then we stay here, together." Whitmore shook his head sadly. "I will pray for you," he said. "I will pray that the Lord opens your eyes before it is too late." He walked away, back toward Grainfield, his black coat flapping in the prairie wind. When he was gone, Rosie looked up at Callum. "We are not going to separate," she said. "It was not a question. Never, promise." "Promise," Odin pressed against Rosie's leg, and she knelt to wrap her arms around his neck. "Grandfather named you after a god," she whispered to the dog. a god of wisdom. You are going to help us be wise, right? Odin licked her face. Callum went back to hammering tin cans. Old Ingrid Dahl came to visit on a cool morning in late September. She was 78 years old, the oldest person in the county, a Norwegian immigrant who had come to Kansas in 1852 when the land was still wild and the Cheyennes still hunted buffalo on the plains. She walked with a cane carved from cottonwood, and her eyes, though faded with age, missed nothing. She stood at the cave entrance for a long time, studying the framework that was beginning to take shape. Then she laughed. It was a different laugh than Harlan Cobb's. This laugh held recognition, memory, something like joy. I know what this is, she said. Her voice carried the lilt of her homeland, never quite erased by 40 years in America. My father built something like this in Minnesota, 1855. Everyone said he was crazy too. Callum stopped working. What happened, he asked. What happened is that we survived the winter of 56, 40 below zero for 2 weeks straight. Our neighbors in their American houses, they burned everything they had and still nearly froze. But we, she tapped her cane against the ground for emphasis, we were warm, not comfortable, but warm. The earth kept us alive. She walked closer, examining the framework with careful eyes. Your grandfather, she said. He was Norwegian? From Bergen. Bergen. Something flickered in her eyes. They know cold in Bergen. They know how to build for it. What is your name, boy? Callum Brennan. My grandfather was Magnus Halvard. Halvard, her hand trembled slightly on her cane. I knew a Halvard once. Long ago, in the old country, a builder. The best in the district, people said. She looked at him with new eyes. You have his hands, she said softly. The same careful way of working. I see it now. Callum did not know what to say. Ingrid Dahl turned to face him fully, and for a moment her aged eyes were sharp and clear. The people in town, she said, they are going to laugh at you. And then they will not be laughing. And then they will not be laughing anymore. She began walking away, then stopped. One more thing, she said. When the worst comes, and it will come, do not let them die. Even the ones who laughed, do not let them die. That is the difference between us and them. We survive, and we help others survive, even when they do not deserve it. She walked away into the morning light, her cane tapping against the hard ground. Callum watched her go. It was the first time anyone had told him he was not crazy. The first time anyone had said his grandfather's knowledge was real. Then he went back to work. October brought the first cold, and with it, more skeptics. They came in ones and twos at first, curious neighbors who had heard the stories in Grainfield. The crazy orphan boy with his garbage dome, the little sister who would surely die before Christmas. They came to see the spectacle. They stayed to offer their opinions. Colton Hewitt was 20 years old, the son of a rancher, with the swagger of someone who had never known real hardship. He rode up on a painted horse and circled the cave twice before dismounting. So this is it, he said, the famous tin can palace. Callum was attaching flattened cans to the framework, wiring each one in place with thin metal salvaged from the same trash piles that had provided the cans. He did not stop working. This is it. Colton walked closer, examining the structure with exaggerated care. I have $5 that says this thing collapses before Thanksgiving. Callum kept wiring. You gonna take the bet? Colton pressed. No, why not? Scared. I do not gamble. Colton laughed and looked around, even though there was no one else to share his amusement. My father says you are going to die out here. He says that little girl is going to freeze to death because her brother is too proud to admit he made a mistake. Rosie emerged from the cave, Odin at her heels. My brother is not proud, she said. My brother is building us a home. What are you building? Colton's smile faltered. I do not need to build anything. My father has a proper house with proper walls and a proper stove. Then maybe you should go back to it, Rosie said, and let us work. Colton stared at her for a long moment. Then he remounted his horse. $5, he said again. Collapse by Thanksgiving. Anyone in town will take that bet. He rode away. Rosie watched him go, her small hands balled into fists. I do not like him, she said. You do not have to like him, Callum said. You just have to outlive his expectations. Prudence Ashford came next. She was the wife of the banker in Grainfield, a woman who wore her prosperity in the form of silk ribbons and imported lace. She arrived in a carriage driven by a hired man, as if visiting a zoo to observe the exotic animals. She did not get out of the carriage. "Oh my," she said, pressing a handkerchief to her nose. "Oh my. Is this where those poor orphan children are living? In a hole in the ground." Her voice carried across the prairie, loud enough for Callum and Rosie to hear clearly. "I told Reverend Whitmore that something should be done. It is simply not Christian to allow children to live like animals, especially the girl, a young girl of good family, reduced to this." She peered at the dome taking shape across the cave mouth. "And what on earth is that? It looks like a heap of rubbish." The hired man murmured something. "They are building it themselves," Prudence repeated. "Out of trash, out of tin cans." She shook her head slowly. "The poor things, the poor deluded things. Well, I have done my Christian duty. I have come to see. Now I can report to the Ladies' Aid Society that the situation is exactly as bad as we feared." She rapped on the side of the carriage. "Take me back to town," she said. "I have seen enough." The carriage rolled away, leaving dust hanging in the still air. Rosie looked at Callum. "She did not even talk to us," she said. "She did not come to talk," Callum said. "She came to watch. There is a difference. Why? Because some people need others to fail. It makes them feel better about their own lives. That is sad." "Yes, it is." Callum picked up another tin can and began flattening it. "But it does not change what we have to do." The dome was 3/4 covered by mid-October. Callum had developed a rhythm: flatten the cans in the morning when his hands were fresh, carry them to the framework in the afternoon, wire them in place until darkness made the work impossible. The covering was tedious and painful. The tin edges were sharp. The wire cut into his fingers. His hands were a constant map of small wounds, cuts healing over cuts over cuts. But the wall grew, row by row, can by can. Elsa Magnuson came to visit on a gray afternoon when the clouds hung low and the air smelled of coming snow. She was 32 years old, Swedish by birth, married to Henrik Magnuson, who worked a farm 2 miles east. She was the only woman Callum's age within a day's walk, and she had heard all the stories. She brought turnips from her garden and real concern in her eyes. "I wanted to see," she said, standing at the entrance. "I wanted to see what you were building." Callum showed her, and he explained the principles his grandfather had taught him. The constant temperature of the earth, the efficiency of heating a small, sealed space, the way the limestone would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night. Elsa listened carefully. Then she said the words that would haunt her for months. "So you are betting your sister's life on a theory about cave temperatures." "It is not a theory. The cave holds steady. It was the same temperature in August as it is now. It will be the same in January. The earth does not change. And if you are wrong," the question hung in the air. "If I am wrong," Callum said slowly, "I will have a shelter I can heat with whatever wood I have managed to collect, which is more than I would have with no shelter at all." Elsa shook her head. "We have neighbors who have died in Kansas blizzards, Callum. The Hendricks family, 4 years ago, father, mother, 2 children, all of them found frozen in their cabin because they ran out of wood. The cabin was properly built. They just did not have enough fuel." She gestured at the dome. "You are not building a proper cabin. You are building a play structure, and you are going to put your sister inside it and hope the winter is not bad." "I am building something that fits what I have," Callum said. 87 cents does not buy proper. 87 cents buys this or nothing. 87 cents buys a ticket to somewhere warmer, not for 2 people and a dog. "Then maybe," Elsa said softly, "maybe one of you should stay and one should go. Henrik and I could take Rosie for the winter. She would have a warm bed, good food. She would be safe." Rosie stepped out of the cave. She had heard everything. "I am not going anywhere," she said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were dreamy. "Callum is my brother. This is my home, and I am staying." Elsa looked at her for a long moment. "You are 12 years old," she said. "You do not understand what winter can do." "I understand that we stay together," Rosie said. "That is all I need to understand." Elsa left the turnips and walked away without saying goodbye. That night, cooking the turnips over a small fire inside the cave, Rosie asked a question. What if she is right, she said. What if the shelter does not work? It will work. But what if it does not? Callum looked at his sister, 12 years old, thin from hard work and scarce food, but alive, still alive. Then we will figure something else out, he said. But I believe in what grandfather taught us. I believe the earth keeps its own temperature. And I believe this shelter is going to save our lives. He reached out and took her hand. I promise you, Rosie. I promise on grandfather's grave, we are going to survive this winter. Odin pressed close to both of them, his warm body a comfort in the cooling night. The fire crackled. Outside, the first snow began to fall. The first hard frost came on October 19th. Callum woke before dawn to find ice on the water bucket inside the cave. Rosie was curled in a tight ball under every blanket they owned. Odin wrapped around her like a living furnace. The shelter was not finished. A section near the top remained open, a gap maybe 2 feet wide where Callum could not reach without a ladder he did not have. He had been stacking rocks to stand on, but the height was tricky and the footing unstable. The gap had to be closed. Today. He worked through the morning, climbing his pile of rocks again and again, wiring cans into place while his fingers went numb and his breath came in white puffs. Rosie brought him water that was half ice. Odin watched from below, occasionally barking encouragement. By noon, the gap was 6 inches wide. By 2 o'clock, it was closed. Callum climbed down from his rock pile, shaking with exhaustion, and looked at what he had built. It was ugly. The cans did not match. Some were rusted, some still shiny, some bent at odd angles where he had forced them to fit. The framework bulged in places where the saplings had not been perfectly aligned. The edges where the dome met the cave walls were sealed with mud and dried grass, creating a lumpy border that looked like it might fall apart in a strong wind. But it was finished, and when he stepped inside and pulled the canvas door closed behind him, the difference was immediate. The wind stopped. Outside, an October breeze was pushing across the prairie, the kind that cut through clothing and made eyes water. Inside the shelter, the air was still, still and cool. Not warm, not yet, but not the biting cold that had woken them that morning. Callum built a fire in the cement pit he had dug near the entrance, channeling the smoke toward a gap he had left in the upper framework. The wood caught slowly, then blazed. Within an hour, the interior was warmer than any room he had slept in since leaving Pennsylvania. He checked the tin walls for drafts, found 3, sealed them with mud, checked again, found 1 more, sealed it too. By nightfall, the temperature inside was holding steady, with a fire no larger than his 2 fists, warm and stable. From a fire he could fuel with kindlings. Rosie pressed her hand against the cave wall, the bare chalk exposed between the dome's edge and the natural ceiling. Callum, she said, the rock is warm. He touched it. She was right. The limestone had absorbed the fire's heat and was radiating it back, slow and steady, like a great stone oven. For the first time since arriving in Kansas, Callum felt something he barely recognized: hope. Here is the science behind what Callum built. Limestone has something called thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. During the day, when the fire burned, the rock soaked up warmth like a sponge soaking up water. At night, when the fire died down, the rock released that stored heat back into the space. The earth behind the limestone maintained a constant temperature of roughly 55 degrees year-round. In summer, that felt cool. In winter, that felt warm compared to the freezing air outside. By sealing the cave mouth with his dome, Callum created an insulated pocket. The earth provided a baseline temperature. The limestone stored and released heat. The tin cans and mud kept the wind out. It was not magic. It was physics. The same physics that keeps wine cellars cool in summer and relatively warm in winter. The same physics that modern passive houses use today. Magnus Halvard had learned it from his grandfather in Norway. Callum had learned it from Magnus. And now, in a cave in Kansas, the knowledge was being proven right. 60 degrees inside while the October wind howled outside, with a fire the size of 2 fists. The skeptics had no idea what was coming. Silas Thornton came by on October 23rd. He sat on his horse, looking at the completed structure, and did not say anything for a long time. The dome stretched across the cave mouth like a strange metal cocoon, tin cans overlapping like scales, smoke rising from a gap at the top, a canvas flap serving as a door. It looked like nothing anyone had ever seen on the Kansas prairie. "You are still alive," Thornton finally said. "Yes, that thing," he gestured at the dome. "What is it? A shelter. A shell across the cave mouth. The inside stays warm." Thornton dismounted and walked closer. He tested the framework with his hands, tugged at the tin shingles, examined the way the structure fitted against the cave walls. "Huh," he said. It was the most positive sound Callum had heard in months. "The idea is sound," Thornton said slowly. "In theory. The cave holds temperature. I will grant you that. And a small space is easier to heat than a large one." He turned to face Callum. "How much wood do you have?" "Half a cord, maybe a little more." "Half a cord." Thornton repeated the words like a death sentence. "Boy, it is October. First real snow could come any week. Half a cord might last you 2 months if you are lucky, and it is a mild winter. It will not get you to spring." "I will get more." "How? You have spent 2 months building this thing. The creek is not getting any closer. And once the deep snow comes, you will not be able to make those trips anymore. The drifts on this prairie pile higher than a man's head." Callum had no answer. He had known in the back of his mind that the wood was a problem. He had hoped the shelter's efficiency would make up for the shortage. But hope was not mathematics. "I am telling you this because I do not want to watch you die," Thornton said. "You are stubborn and maybe a little crazy, but you have worked harder than most men I know. That counts for something." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a canvas sack. "This is dried venison. Should keep you through October if you ration it." He hesitated. "And I have some scrap wood, cottonwood mostly. Not the best for burning, but it is wood. I will bring you a quarter cord if you will trade labor in the spring." Callum stared at him. This was not the same man who had told him he would die before spring. "I will take it," he said, "and I will work your spring planning if I am able." "If you are able." Thornton shook his head. "God help you, boy. I hope this contraption of yours works, because if it does not, I do not know what else to tell you." He rode away, and Callum went back to sealing cracks in the dome, one handful of mud at a time. November came with teeth. The temperature dropped and rose and dropped again, each cycle a little colder than the last. The first real snow fell on November 8th, 2 inches of white that turned the chalk bluffs into something strange and beautiful. Rosie made a snow angel. Odin barked and ran in circles. Callum watched and tried not to count the shrinking woodpile. Inside the shelter, with a small fire burning, the interior stayed comfortable. Rosie slept without shivering now. She had gained a little weight from the venison Thornton had brought, but every day the woodpile grew smaller. Callum made 2 more trips to the creek before the drifts got too deep. He returned exhausted each time, carrying as much as his body could bear. It was not enough. It would never be enough. December brought deeper cold and darker fears. Christmas was approaching, and Callum had nothing to give his sister except warmth and survival. No presents, no decorations, no feast. But on Christmas Eve, with the temperature at 18 below zero outside, the interior of the dome held steady, warm enough to survive, warm enough to live. Rosie found a tin can that was shinier than the others, one that had not yet rusted. She cut it into a rough star shape with Callum's knife, her small hands careful with the sharp edges. They hung it from the highest point of the dome's interior, where it caught the firelight and threw tiny reflections across the chalk walls. "Is Christmas going to find us here?" Rosie asked. "In a cave. Christmas finds everyone," Callum said. He gave her a peppermint stick he had been hiding since Grainfield. 2 cents, an extravagance he could not afford. But worth it for the look on her face. That night, alone by the fire while Rosie slept, Callum counted the remaining wood. Not enough for 3 months, but more than they would have needed in a regular cabin. The shelter was working, better than he had dared to hope. They were going to make it, unless something worse came along. Here is what Callum did not know on Christmas Eve, 1887. Something worse was coming. In 2 weeks, the most devastating blizzard in Kansas history would sweep across the plains. The school children's blizzard, they would call it later, because so many children died trying to walk home from school. Hundreds would freeze to death across 4 states. The temperature would drop 60 degrees in 6 hours. And everything Callum had built, everything he had sacrificed, everything his grandfather had taught him would be put to the ultimate test. But he did not know that yet. On Christmas Eve, he watched his sister sleep, warm and safe in a shelter made of garbage, and he allowed himself to believe that the worst was behind them. He was wrong. January began mild. The first week brought temperatures in the 20s, cold but not dangerous. The sun appeared for hours at a time, melting the surface of the snow into a crust that almost supported a person's weight. Callum managed 2 trips to the creek, bringing back armloads of dead cottonwood that he dried inside the cave before burning. Word spread through the scattered homesteads. The cave boy was still listening. His sister was still alive. The garbage shelter was working. Elsa Magnuson came by on January 8th. Her face was red from the cold, and her manner was different than it had been in October. Less pity, more curiosity. "They are saying your shelter holds 60 degrees, she said. "Most of the time, yes, with just a small fire. Our soddy barely holds 40 on the coldest nights. Henrik stuffs rags in every crack and we still wake up with frost on the blankets." Callum showed her the interior. The sealed tin walls, the mud-chinked edges, the way the limestone seemed to breathe warmth. Elsa walked around the small space, touching the walls, feeling the heat that seemed to come from the rock itself. "It is like an oven," she said. "A stone oven turned inside out. That is exactly what it is." She stood there for a long moment, her earlier skepticism visibly crumbling. "I told you this was a toy," she said. "A play structure. I said it would not work." "You did. I was wrong." The words seemed to cost her something. "Callum, I was wrong and I am sorry. You understood something the rest of us did not." She left with a promise to send Henrik over to discuss the construction. "Maybe they could build something similar," she said, in addition to their soddy that used the same principles. For the first time, someone wanted to learn from Callum instead of warn him. But the mild weather would not last. He could feel it in the air, in the quality of the light, in the way the birds had vanished from the sky. Something was building in the north, something worse than anything December had delivered. On the morning of January 11th, the temperature rose to 40 degrees. 40 degrees in January, the warmest day in months. Snow melted off the dome and ran in rivulets down the chalk bluff. The children played outside for the first time in weeks. Rosie threw slush balls at Callum. Odin ran circles around them both, barking with joy. But Callum felt uneasy. The warmth was wrong. Too warm. Too sudden. Too complete. His grandfather had a saying about weather like this: "The lamb comes before the lion." At sunset, he looked north. The horizon was wrong. A darkness there. A weight in the sky that had nothing to do with nightfall. It stretched from east to west in a solid band, blotting out the stars as it grew. Callum had never seen anything like it. It looked less like clouds than like a wall, a physical barrier rolling toward them across the prairie. He brought Rosie inside early, barred the canvas door with its wooden frame, built the fire larger than usual. Then he filled every container they had with water from the melting snow. Water that would freeze again soon, he was certain, and might not be easily gathered for a while. Odin would not settle. He paced the small space, whining, his ears flat against his head. "Animals know," Magnus used to say. "They feel what we cannot feel. When the dog is restless, pay attention." Callum paid attention. At 8 o'clock, the wind began to rise. At 9 o'clock, the temperature began to drop. At 10 o'clock, the first snow began to fall. Not gently like the snow of November. Sideways, driving, screaming. Rosie pressed close to Callum, her eyes wide. "What is happening?" she asked. "A storm," he said. "A bad one." "How bad?" He looked at the tin walls already beginning to shake. At Odin pressing himself against Rosie's legs. At the fire struggling against drafts that found their way through cracks he thought were sealed. "I do not know," he said honestly, "but we are going to be all right. The shelter will hold." He said it with more confidence than he felt. The blizzard struck with full force just before midnight. One moment the wind was gusting, unpleasant but manageable. The next moment, it was screaming, a sound like nothing Callum had ever heard, a roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the entire sky had torn open and was emptying itself onto the prairie. The temperature plummeted. Callum could feel it even inside the shelter. The sudden bite in the air, the fire struggling against an enemy it could not see. He fed it more wood, too much wood, more than he could afford, and watched the flames bend sideways as gusts found their way through cracks he thought were sealed. By 1 in the morning, the tin walls were rattling. By 2, he could hear ice crystals pinging against the metal like someone throwing sand. By 3, the world outside had ceased to exist. There was only the howling white nothing, pressing against the shelter from all sides, trying to get in. Rosie woke crying. Odin woke silent, which was worse. His eyes were huge in the firelight, fixed on the shaking walls. "Is the house going to fall down?" Rosie asked. "No, the house is strong. The house will hold." Callum pulled her close, wrapping blankets around both of them, positioning their bodies between her and the door. If the shelter failed, if the tin tore away, if the saplings cracked, they would have seconds, not minutes. The cold outside was not cold anymore. It was something else entirely, something that killed. At some point in the darkness, 4 in the morning, maybe 5, Callum heard something beneath the wind. A rhythm, a pattern, something almost like pounding. He pressed his ear to the canvas door, straining to hear through the shriek of the blizzard. There it was again, not wind, not ice. Someone hitting wood or stone, over and over, a desperate drumbeat barely audible through the chaos. Someone was outside. Callum cracked the door against the wind's pressure and immediately regretted it. The cold hit him like a physical blow, driving ice crystals into his eyes, his mouth, his lungs. He could not see anything. Just white, absolute white, as if the world had been erased and replaced with nothing. "Hello," he screamed into the void. No answer, just the wind, just the endless howling, white. But the pounding continued. Somewhere to his left, close, maybe 50 feet away, maybe less. Someone was out there, someone alive, someone who would die in minutes if they did not find shelter. Callum looked back at his sister. Rosie, clutching Odin, her face white with fear. If he went outside, he might not find his way back. The whiteout was complete. 5 steps from the door and he would be lost, wandering blind until the cold took him. But someone was out there. Rosie, his voice was steady somehow. "Stay here. Keep the fire burning. Keep Odin close. Do not open the door for anyone except me. Callum, do not go. I will be right back." He grabbed the rope they used for a clothesline, tied one end to the doorframe, and wrapped the other end around his waist. Then he stepped out into the white death of January 12th, 1888. What Callum did not know in that moment was that across the prairie, dozens of people were dying. The Henderson family, 5 people, froze in their cabin when their stove failed. Old man Driscoll died on his own porch, 3 feet from his door. The Westergaard boy, 14 years old, froze trying to reach the barn to save the livestock. And on the road that passed, within 100 yards of Callum's cave, 9 people from 3 different families had been caught in the open when the blizzard struck. They had been traveling to the Thompson house for a gathering. They got separated in the whiteout. They were dying. One of them was Elsa Magnuson, the woman who had told Callum he was building a toy. She was 40 feet from the cave entrance, collapsed in the snow, too weak to keep pounding. And Callum, 18 years old, armed with nothing but a rope and his grandfather's teachings, was about to save her life. The cold was absolute. It penetrated Callum's coat, his shirt, his skin, his bones. Within seconds, his face was numb. Within a minute, he could not feel his hands. He kept one hand on the rope, the other stretched in front of him, and pushed into the wind toward the sound of pounding. 5 steps, 10. The rope played out behind him, his only connection to survival. The pounding was closer now. Definitely closer, coming from somewhere ahead and to the left. "Hello," he screamed again. This time a voice answered, faint, desperate, nearly swallowed by the storm. "Help! Over here!" Callum pushed toward the voice. The rope ran out. He had maybe 40 feet of line, and the voice was still ahead of him. He hesitated for one terrible moment. Then he untied the rope from his waist and let it fall into the snow, keeping only the memory of its direction. If he was wrong, if he lost his bearing, he would die out here. Rosie would wait in the shelter, feeding the fire, watching the door, and her brother would never come back. He kept moving, his foot hit something solid. A body. Someone curled on the ground, barely moving, their clothes already stiff with ice. Callum grabbed them, grabbed clothing, grabbed arms, grabbed whatever he could hold, and pulled. The body was heavy, resistant, frozen to the ground in places. He pulled harder. "Get up," he screamed. "Get up or you will die." A face turned toward him. A woman's face, ice-crusted, eyes barely open. "Elsa Magnuson." "Callum," she whispered. "Is that Callum? Get up, now." He hauled her to her feet, draped her arm over his shoulders, and turned to find the rope. It was not there. The wind had shifted, or he had turned wrong, or the rope had been buried in drifting snow. He could not see it. He could not see anything. The cave was somewhere behind him, maybe 40 feet away, but behind and 40 feet meant nothing in a whiteout. Every direction was the same. Every direction was death. Callum stood in the howling white holding a dying woman, completely lost. Then he remembered the wind. When the storm started, the wind had been from the north-northwest, driving directly against the cave mouth. The shelter's door faced roughly south. If he walked into the wind, he would walk toward the cave. He turned his face into the blast of ice and snow. Let it sandpaper his skin. Let it blind him completely. And walked. One step, two, three. Elsa was barely moving now, her weight almost dead on his shoulders. The wind screamed, the cold burned. 5 steps, 6, 7. He was going to miss the cave. He was going to walk right past it and keep walking until they both froze. 8 steps, 9. His hand hit stone. Not the door, the stone of the bluff itself, the chalk face beside the cave entrance. He felt along it, found the curve where natural rock gave way to bent saplings and flattened tin, found the canvas door. Rosie, open it now. The door swung inward. Warmth poured out. Glorious, impossible warmth. Callum shoved Elsa inside and followed, pulling the door closed behind them, collapsing against it as the wind fought to follow them in. For a long moment there was only breathing. Only the fire's crackle and Odin's whine and the distant howl of the blizzard outside. Then Elsa spoke. "Henrik," she said. "Henrik is still out there. And the Miller family. We were all trying to reach the Thompson house. We got separated." Her voice broke. "Henrik went one way, I went another. And I do not know where anyone is. I just kept walking. I walked into the bluff, and I could not go any further." "How many?" Callum asked. "How many were with you?" 9. "The Millers have 3 children, and the Cobb boy came with us. The storekeeper's son, 9 people. 9 people lost in a blizzard, walking along a road that passed within 100 yards of the cave." Callum looked at his fire, his woodpile, his sister. Then he looked at the door, shaking in its frame, and the white death beyond it. "Rosie," he said, "build the fire up. Use as much wood as you need. I am going back out." 4 times that night, Callum Brennan walked into the storm. 4 times he found someone dying in the snow and dragged them back to the cave. The second trip brought Henrik Magnuson, 200 yards east of the entrance, crawling on his hands and knees with frostbitten fingers. The third trip brought Cora Miller and her youngest child, a girl of 6 who had stopped crying because she no longer had the strength. They had fallen into a drift and could not get out. The fourth trip brought Josiah Cobb, 16 years old, son of Harlan Cobb, the storekeeper who had laughed at Callum's garbage and dreamed of taking his land. Josiah was 30 feet from the cave entrance when Callum found him. 30 feet, but he was facing the wrong direction, walking away from safety instead of toward it. If Callum had not found him, he would have frozen within sight of salvation. There was a 5th trip. Callum stood at the door preparing to go out again. His hands were swollen, waxy, the color of old candles. Frostbite. He could barely feel them anymore. But Arthur Miller and his 2 older children were still out there somewhere. "I have to go again," he said. "You cannot." Elsa's voice was raw. "You have been out 4 times. Your face is frostbitten. Your hands are ruined. If you go out again, you will die. Callum reached for the door. Rosie grabbed his arm. He looked down at his sister, 12 years old, thin and pale, shaking with fear. Callum, she said, you saved 5 people. You cannot save everyone, but you can stay here with me. Her eyes were bright with tears. Please, she said, please do not leave me alone. Odin pressed against Callum's legs, whining. The dog looked up at him with those mismatched eyes, one blue and one brown, the same eyes that had watched over Magnus in Norway, that had crossed an ocean, that had kept watch over 2 orphans in a cave at the edge of nowhere. Stay, those eyes seemed to say. Stay with us. And Callum looked at his sister who needed him, who was the only family he had left, who would be utterly alone in the world if he died in that storm. He closed his eyes, and he stayed. Here is the truth about that night. Callum Brennan could not save everyone. Arthur Miller and his 2 older children, Thomas, 14, and Sarah, 12, were found 3 days later. Frozen, a quarter-mile from the road, they had walked in circles until they could not walk anymore. They died within 300 yards of the cave, 300 yards from warmth and survival. If Callum had made one more trip, if he had found them, they might have lived. Or he might have died with them, leaving Rosie alone. We cannot know. What we know is that on that terrible night, in a tin can shelter that everyone had mocked, lives were saved. People who would have died found warmth and safety because an 18-year-old boy had believed in what his grandfather taught him. Sometimes that is all we can do, save who we can, and learn to live with who we could not. If you have ever had to make a choice like that, a choice where there was no right answer, I want you to know that you are not alone, and I hope you have found peace. The blizzard lasted 18 hours. It ended sometime after midnight on January 13th, the wind dying as suddenly as it had arrived, the temperature holding at 18 degrees below zero, in a silence that felt like deafness. The stars came out, brilliant and cold, indifferent to the damage below. At dawn, Callum opened the door and looked out at a changed world. Snow had drifted higher than his head in some places. The landscape was unrecognizable, smooth white curves where rough terrain had been. No roads visible, no fences, no markers of any kind, just white, endless white, stretching to every horizon. Inside the shelter, the survivors sat around a dying fire. Callum and Rosie, Elsa and Henrik Magnuson, Henrik's hands wrapped in cloth, ruined by frostbite. Cora Miller and her youngest daughter, the 6-year-old who had finally fallen asleep against Odin's warm body, and Josiah Cobb, the storekeeper's son, who had not stopped shaking since Callum dragged him inside. The woodpile was nearly gone. The fire had burned through most of what remained during the long night, keeping the shelter warm enough for survival. But they were alive. The temperature inside, even with the fire dying, was still above 50 degrees, warm enough, in a dome made of tin cans and bent saplings, while the world outside sat at 18 below zero. Silas Thornton arrived in the afternoon, breaking through the drifts on snowshoes, leading a mule loaded with supplies. He had expected to find bodies. He had expected to find the shelter collapsed, the orphans frozen, another tragedy to add to the long list of prairie tragedies. Instead, he found survivors sitting around a fire, drinking tea made from melted snow, alive. He stood in the entrance for a long moment, counting. 2 children, 4 adults. The dog pressed against the little girl's legs. Then he looked at Callum. The boy's face was raw with frostbite. His hands were wrapped in cloth, already beginning to blister. He had lost weight in the night, burned through reserves his body could not afford to lose. But his eyes were clear, and he was alive. I counted bodies this morning, Thornton said. His voice was rough. 12 across the county so far, more to come when the snow melts. He paused. The Hendersons, all 5 of them, froze in their cabin when the stovepipe blew off. Old man Driscoll, found on his porch. The Westergaard boy. Callum nodded slowly. And Arthur Miller, he said, and his 2 older children. How do you know? I looked for them, Callum said. Last night, I could not find them. Thornton stared at him. You went out in that storm more than once. 4 times. I found 5 people. I could not find the Millers. You could have died. I know, but you went anyway. I had to. Thornton was silent for a long moment. Then he did something Callum had never seen him do. He smiled. Your grandfather, he said. Magnus Halvard. He was a builder, you said. Yes, he must have been one hell of a man. He was. Well, Thornton looked around the shelter, the tin walls that had not buckled, the framework that had not broken, the space that had held warmth while the world outside tried to kill everything in it. I guess he taught you well. Later that day, when the others had been evacuated to town and Callum and Rosie were alone again, Silas Thornton came back. He stood in the entrance to the shelter, his weathered face unreadable. I told you that you would die, he said. You did. I told you that child would freeze. You did. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, almost gentle. Callum Brennan, I have lived in Kansas for 12 years. I have survived storms that killed men better prepared than me. I thought I knew what it took to make it through a prairie winter. He paused. I was wrong. He stepped forward and held out his hand. Callum shook it. What you built here, Thornton said, I do not fully understand it, but I know it works. And I know you saved lives that would have been lost otherwise. He released Callum's hand. I owe you an apology, and so does everyone else who told you this was impossible. We were all so certain we knew better, but you understood something we did not. What is that? Thornton smiled again, that rare expression that transformed his weathered face. The earth keeps its own warmth, he said. You just have to know how to use it. Reverend Ezekiel Whitmore came to the shelter 3 days later. He stood in the entrance, looking at the tin walls, the willow framework, the space that had saved lives. Then he took off his hat. I called your grandfather's knowledge pagan, he said. I said it had no place in Christian country. He bowed his head. I was wrong. God works through many vessels. He uses many tools. And on the night of January 12th, he used a dome made of tin cans to save his children. He looked up at Callum. I will be preaching on Sunday about the sin of pride, about how we think we know better than those who came before us, about how the old ways, the ways our grandparents knew, sometimes contain wisdom we have forgotten. He paused. I hope you will come. You and your sister. You would be most welcome. Callum nodded. We will think about it. Whitmore put his hat back on and walked away into the snow. Josiah Cobb came back to the shelter twice in the weeks that followed. The first time he came to thank Callum properly. He stood in the entrance, 16 years old, the son of the man who had laughed at the garbage shelter and dreamed of taking Callum's land. You saved my life, Josiah said. His voice shook. I was 30 feet away, 30 feet, and I was walking the wrong direction. I would have died, I know. My father, Josiah hesitated. My father will never admit he was wrong about you. He is not built that way. But I want you to know, I know. I know what you did, and I will never forget it. The second time Josiah came, he brought wood, a quarter cord of good oak loaded on a sled. From my father's supply, he said. He does not know I took it, and I do not care. Callum accepted the wood without comment. Some debts cannot be repaid with words. Some lessons can only be learned through action. Josiah Cobb learned that lesson at 18 below zero, crawling through the snow toward a death he could not see, until a hand reached down and pulled him back to life. Spring came late that year. The snow lingered into March, then melted in a rush that turned every creek into a torrent and every low spot into a pond. But by April, the prairie was green again, and the survivors were rebuilding. The blizzard of January 12, 1888, had killed hundreds of people across the plains. Entire families wiped out. Communities devastated. The newspapers called it the school children's blizzard because so many children died trying to walk home from school. But in Gove County, Kansas, something different happened. Word spread about the cave shelter, about the orphan boy who had built it from garbage, about the lives it had saved. Colton Hewitt, the young man who had bet $5 that the shelter would collapse before Thanksgiving, came to Callum in early April. He did not come to pay his bet. He had never actually placed it with anyone. He came to learn. I want to build one, he said. His swagger was gone. His eyes were serious. After what happened in January, after what I saw, he paused. I was wrong about you. I called you crazy. I laughed at what you were building. And you saved people while I sat in my father's house and prayed the walls would hold. He looked at Callum directly. Teach me. Callum taught him. He had taught Colton Hewitt and others who had lost fingers to frostbite that night and wanted to make sure it never happened again. He taught Henrik Magnusson, whose hands had healed enough to work but would never be the same. He taught 3 other families who had seen the shelter and wanted to understand. He taught them all for free. My grandfather never charged for knowledge that could save lives, he said. Neither will I. By October of 1888, 7 new earth-sheltered structures had been built along the chalk bluffs of Gove County. Not all of them were domes. Some were extensions of existing soddies, incorporating the thermal mass principles Callum had demonstrated. Some were entirely new designs, adapted to different terrain. But all of them used the same basic understanding. The earth keeps its own temperature. Use it, do not fight it. Harlan Cobb never came to see the shelter. He never acknowledged that Callum had saved his son's life. He never apologized for laughing at the garbage dome, for predicting the orphans' deaths, for plotting to take their land. He simply stopped talking about them entirely. When someone mentioned Callum Brennan in the general store, Cobb would find something else to do. Inventory to check, customers to serve, anything but acknowledge what had happened. Some people cannot admit they were wrong, old Ingrid Dahl told Callum. It would cost them too much. Their whole picture of themselves would have to change. She shook her head. Let him be. His silence speaks louder than any apology. The quarry company from Kansas City eventually gave up on the chalk bluffs. Too complicated, they said. Too many small landowners. Not worth the trouble. Callum filed his 5-year proof in 1892, completing the homestead requirements and gaining permanent title to his land. He was 23 years old. He had survived 5 Kansas winters in a shelter he built for $12, and he had proven his grandfather right. Rosie Brennan grew up in the shadow of the chalk bluffs. She learned to read in the shelter, by firelight, using books Callum traded for with labor. She learned to write on salvaged paper with ink made from berries. By the time she was 16, she was teaching other children in the settlement. By 20, she had become the first official school teacher of the Gove County Consolidated Schools. She married in 1897 a young farmer named James Whitfield, who had come to Kansas from Ohio. He built her a proper house, wood-framed with glass windows, but she always kept a small fire burning in a stone-lined pit that connected to the earth. Old habits, she said when people asked. The good kind. She had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. The girl, born in 1902, was named Martha, after the grandmother Rosie barely remembered. Callum married in 1895. Wren Fairchild was 22 years old, the daughter of a family who had arrived after the blizzard. She had heard the stories before she ever met the man. The first time she saw the shelter, she stood in the entrance for a long time, just looking. You built this when you were 18, she said. Yes. With 87 cents. Yes. She turned to face him, and her eyes were bright. Show me everything, she said. I want to understand. He showed her, and when he was done, she asked him to show her again. They were married 3 months later, in the same shelter where Callum had saved lives 7 years before. Reverend Whitmore performed the ceremony. Odin died in the spring of 1896. He was 12 years old, ancient for a working dog, and his body had finally worn out. His eyes had clouded, his legs had weakened, but he still followed Rosie everywhere she went, still pressed close to her when she sat by the fire, still watched the door as if expecting Magnus to walk through it. On his last day, he crawled outside and lay down on the bluff overlooking the prairie, the same spot where he had sat so many times, watching the wind move through the grass. Callum sat beside him, stroking his graying fur. Good boy, he said. You kept us safe. You were with us from the beginning. Now you can rest. Odin's tail moved once, weakly. Then he was still. They buried him on that bluff, overlooking the land he had helped them survive. Callum carved a marker from limestone. Odin, faithful friend, from grandfather to grandson, 1884 to 1896. Rosie cried for 3 days. Then she wiped her eyes and went back to teaching. Because that was what the Brennans did. They grieved. And they kept going. Years passed. Decades. Callum Brennan died in 1931 at the age of 62. He had lived long enough to see automobiles replace horses, to see electricity come to the plains. to see his grandchildren grow up in a world that would have seemed like magic to the boy who arrived in Kansas with 87 cents. He died in his sleep, in the house Wren had made him build when she tired of living in a cave. But he was buried on the bluff next to Odin, overlooking the shelter he had built when he was young and desperate, and everyone said he would fail. Rosie outlived him by 14 years. She died in 1945 at the age of 70. In her final months, she gathered her children and grandchildren and told them the stories. About the train from Pennsylvania, about the 87 cents, about the tin cans and the willow saplings, and the night when the temperature dropped 60 degrees and her brother walked into the storm 4 times to save strangers who had called him crazy. Before she died, she gave one last gift to history. The Gove County Historical Museum is a small building in a small town in a part of Kansas most people have never heard of. But in a glass case near the entrance, there is an object that stops visitors in their tracks. A star, cut from a tin can. Tarnished now, the edge is rough, where a 12-year-old girl shaped it with her brother's knife on Christmas Eve, 1887. Beneath it, a small card reads, Christmas, 1887, made by Rosie Brennan, age 12. The tin can shelter that held the star saved lives in the Great Blizzard of 1888. In 1978, researchers from Kansas State University visited the site of the original shelter. The dome itself had long since collapsed, but the cave remained, and the chalk walls still bore the marks where Callum had carved holes for the sapling framework. They measured the temperature inside, 54 degrees Fahrenheit, in the middle of January. Exactly what Magnus Halvard had predicted, exactly what his grandson had believed. The researchers published a paper about thermal mass construction and earth-sheltered design. They cited the Brennan shelter as one of the earliest documented examples of passive heating principles in American frontier architecture. The paper was read by architects and engineers around the world. Magnus Halvard's knowledge, passed from grandfather to grandson in a kitchen in Pennsylvania, had finally been validated by science, 90 years late, but validated nonetheless. Here's what I want you to remember about this story. Callum Brennan was 18 years old. He had 87 cents. He had a 12-year-old sister depending on him, and he had no experience, no resources, no support. Everyone told him he would fail. Everyone told him he would die. Everyone told him his grandfather's knowledge was worthless, outdated, the superstition of people who did not know any better. He built the shelter anyway. And when the worst storm in Kansas history arrived, lives were saved because of what he built. Sometimes that is all it takes. One person who refuses to give up. One person who believes in something everyone else has dismissed. One person who says, I know this is right and I am going to prove it. If you are that person in your own life, if you are holding on to something everyone else thinks is foolish, I want you to know that you are not alone. Your moment may be coming, and when it does, you will be ready. The tin star still catches the light in that museum case. Every afternoon around 3 o'clock, the sun comes through the window at just the right angle, and the star throws tiny reflections across the wall, the same way it threw reflections across chalk walls on Christmas Eve, 1887, when a boy and his sister sat by a fire in a shelter made of garbage and whispered promises to each other in the dark. The storm passed, the star remained, and something, in the end, was enough. The end. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched you, if it reminded you of someone in your own life who refused to give up when everyone said they should, I hope you will share it with them. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. We tell stories like this one every week. Stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Stories about the knowledge our grandparents carried that we have almost forgotten. Stories about survival and hope and the stubborn human refusal to accept defeat. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember, the earth keeps its own warmth. You just have to know how to use it.